One day my eldest son came home asking about the ESV, and I got it, and I was really intrigued by how similar to my Greek New Testament it flowed when I was up on that end of the Bible. I did a little bit of looking around in the Old Testament as well. Very nice translation.
My name is Brad. I'm a pastor in Champaign, and my preferred Bible version is the ESV, the English Standard Version. I don't know that there is maybe a real practical sense to that. The ESV is the first Bible that I read from beginning to end. And so when I think about Scripture, it's in the ESV. The same way some people maybe they grew up with the King James Version or they grew up with the NIV, and when they think about a Bible verse that they remember or partially remember, it's in that translation. For me, that translation is the ESV. I like it just because it is familiar. It's sort of the default Bible for me mentally, but it's also, I think, a good marriage between being respectful to the text and also readable in everyday sort of language.
All right, so my name is Matthew. I pastor the Peoria church here in Illinois, and the version I preach from is the NIV, the New Andrews Study Bible. The version I study from is the NET. The NET is the New English translation, and what I love about the NET is it has like 58,000 notes. Now, my issue is as a pastor, I don't want a bunch of notes at the bottom of the page telling me what all these things mean. That's too easy. I want notes that, as the NET does, that explain why the translators chose to translate words a certain way. And so that helps me to work through the text in a way that isn't like, just look at footnote 5 for a really easy answer about what this stuff means. I don't want the easy answers. I want to wrestle with it myself. And so that's what the NET does for me. No easy answers in the NET, the New English translation. But it is a joy to work through. In fact, if you go to Ecclesiastes in the NET, the first page has one line of actual biblical text, and then the rest of the page are translator's notes and study notes to help you understand the first line of Ecclesiastes. And I love that. I live for that kind of stuff.
I'm Glenn Hill. I pastor the Springfield, Illinois church, also a couple of others in Normal and Decatur. The question was given, what English translation do I like to read? That's because I really prefer reading my Bible in New Testament Greek or Old Testament Hebrew, sometimes some touch of Aramaic. Amen. But when I'm reading personally in English, I tend to go at this time in my life with the New King James Version. I grew up with the original, well, I shouldn't say original King James Version. It's morphed again and again over the 400 years till I got hold of it, and it's changed so much. But when I memorized Scripture, I memorized it in the King James Version, and so that's what flowed naturally. And each person who sticks with a particular version long enough will have a feel for that version, myself included.
If I really could have my way and everyone could just use a Bible translation, I would say the NET. There's a value in text being a little bit unfamiliar if it's all unfamiliar together. And I think we need that from time to time. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I chose the NET for my study Bible, is so the unfamiliarity of it will make me think about the text. If I'm reading a familiar text that I've memorized for years and years and years and years, it's hard to reread that text and come at it from a fresh perspective. You tend to your mind just glides over those familiar words. And so when you get a translation that has speed bumps, it forces you to slow down and think about why that bump is there And whether it's right, it's a good translation, or maybe you would go back with a traditional translation or something. That's what I like about the NAT. It causes me to stop and think about a lot of these verses and stories I've read so many times.
Like when Mr. T came to my church in Elmhurst, and afterward his little escort that was along with him passed out these little Mr. T in your pocket things, and if you press one of those buttons, it just says, "Quit your jibba jabba."
Mr. T came to your church?
Yes, he did. For a social event, not for the worship service.
That was that.
Yes.
So when I'm talking to someone who's been in the church for a while and maybe their default Bible is the King James Version, I tend to recommend the English Standard Version because it is not too dissimilar, but it is definitely more readable, I find. But it's not going to be so different, so modern that it's going to be immediately a turnoff for someone who's maybe more familiar with an older sense of Scripture. For newer members, especially brand new members, usually the New Living Translation, the NLT, is what I recommend. It's really readable. It's still a good translation, even though it follows maybe a different track than the ESV or some of the more literal translations. And so, yeah, either way, if ESV if you're old school, NLT if you are maybe interested in more a readable version.
One day my eldest son came home asking about the ESV, and I got it, and I was really intrigued by how similar to my Greek New Testament it flowed when I was up on that end of the Bible. I did a little bit of looking around in the Old Testament as well. Very nice translation. But my use in public tends to be according to the congregation I'm with. Some congregations feel like only one particular version is appropriate, and if that's the way they feel, I can go with it. Many of the more traditional congregations have liked the King James Version. When I worked in Korea 9 years, I tended to use predominantly New King James Version or New International Version, because to go to English as a second language, King James is a big stretch that kind of leads you in strange places. But at some point, it's also helpful just to read something that flows, that gives you a sense of the big picture and the big storyline. If you don't read Greek or Hebrew, I would recommend reading at least 2 other versions. One to make you ask, what's going on? And another just to compare, is it the same or different? And wherever they're different, check out why with the commentaries or the notes in the margins. And by doing that, it gives you some of the advantages that people get who actually do step into the biblical languages themselves.
So how do you want to do this? Are you going to ask off camera, or do you want me to just jump?
Off camera, and you look at the lens.
Okay, and go straight in.
And you just go straight in.
Okay.
Something.
Okay. Name. What church do you pastor?
Sorry.
Oh dear.
Okay. Name. What church do you pastor, and what English